Okay, good evening, actually. It happens to be evening at the moment. This is a video lecture on Willard Van Orman Quine and his two dogmas of empiricism. It's a rather challenging article. I found it challenging, and I'm not sure that I will be able to get to it in its entirety in a single um, session. So I thought, well, let me record a lecture, and it might run a little bit long, but you can break it up and watch it in parts, etc. But that way I know that I have kind of covered the whole thing, or at least I've covered it to whatever extent I can. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen and share, okay. And then slideshow, yes, and from the beginning. Why isn't it happening? Okay, it seems to be happening. Okay, so this article Quine wrote, where he identifies what he takes to be two dogmas of empiricism. In other words, these are two, how can this, okay, yeah. These are two items that empiricists have held to since the days of Locke and Hume as sort of unquestioned truths. And he finds them to be not only questionable, but indeed false. And, spoiler alert, the two dogmas he attacks is the analytic-synthetic distinction and empirical reductionism. Now, the analytic-synthetic distinction, remember, is that he thinks, going back to Hume, actually really predating Hume, this notion that sentences are either analytic, A equals A sentences, which are either necessarily true, all bachelors are unmarried, or necessarily false, some bachelors are married. But the truth or falsity of these is based on the meaning of the words involved and having little or nothing to do with actual experience, versus synthetic claims, A equal B claims, such as all swans are white. So we've gone over that a couple of times. It's probably worth mentioning that David Hume, his Hume's fork, which you're probably sick of Hume's fork by this point, but relations of ideas are supposed to be analytic. They are also supposed to be a priori. And so it's important to realize those mean different things. Analytic is the kind of sentence it is, A equals A. A priori indicates the way in which we can come to know it or justify it. And so a priori is independent of experience. So those are two different claims. Analytic, again, the kind of sentence it is, the kind of claim that it is in terms of its meaning. And synthetic, again, I'm sorry, a priori, how we come to know these things. Likewise, the matters of fact that Hume talks about distinguishes synthetic a posteriori. And again, those are two different features of the sentence. Synthetic is A equals B, where the subject and the predicate are actually different concepts. And a posteriori, meaning we come to know this based on experience. So could I come to know an analytic claim by experience, a posteriori? I suppose, right? If I interviewed each and every bachelor in the world, then I would know that all bachelors, at least all currently living bachelors, are unmarried. If I interviewed each and every one of them, and if I did so, I would know this a posteriori, based on experience. That's weird. It would be a waste of my time. We would think that would be very silly. But I'm just pointing out that how we come to know a claim and the kind of claim that it is are two different. Now, Hume collapses that into a single concept of relations of ideas, where he's constituting analytic a priori and matters of fact, where he's combining synthetic a posteriori or empirical. Then we did talk about Kant, who suggested that there's a third way of categorizing things, which would be the synthetic a priori. In other words, claims I can know a priori, which are A equals B claims. Whatever you think of all of this, I just want you to keep in mind what these different terms mean. What Quine is going to argue is that the whole synthetic analytic distinction can't be maintained. It simply cannot be maintained. And the main reason he argues that, again, preview of coming attractions, is because he doesn't think we can give an account, a non-circular account of analyticity. And if we can't give a non-circular account of analyticity, then it's not really clear that we can rely on this as a useful concept. The other dogma that Quine attacks is reductionism. What is reductionism? This is the project that begins at least with Locke, maybe it predates Locke, but it certainly begins with Locke, which is that in order for an idea to be legitimate, we have to be able to reduce it down to some elemental bit of experience. So if you remember way back when we were talking about Locke, he thought that complex ideas can be reduced to simple ideas, and simple ideas ultimately trace back to simple sensations. So where we have the complex idea of the apple, which is red, round, sweet, and solid, then this can be traced back to that's the complex idea. The simple ideas, red, round, sweet, and solid, those ultimately trace back to some sort of simple sensation. And so we need to do this reduction such that the complex concept gains its legitimacy and its usefulness because we can do the provenance and we can reduce it down to these elemental bits of experience. You have something similar going on with the early days of science in the 20th century, where you have Rudolf Carnap trying to come up with protocol sentences and pure observation sentences and trying to show how knowledge, scientific knowledge, is reducible to these elemental bits of experience and these elemental datum or data. Again, Kant thinks that this is a mistake and is a dogma that we are well rid of. All right, so why does he say these things? Well, that's what we're about to discover. So one dogma is the analytic synthetic distinction. It's the belief that some fundamental cleavage between truths which are analytic or grounded in the meanings independent of matters of fact, and truths which are synthetic and grounded in the facts themselves, along with the belief that some truths are necessarily true while others are only contingently true. And we don't need to dwell on this at present, but you'll recall that Hume claimed that the only sentences that were necessarily true are those sentences, the contradiction of which, the denial of which was a logical contradiction. So all bachelors are unmarried is true, but it's necessarily true because the claim some bachelors are married is a logical contradiction or involves a logical contradiction. But where we don't have logical contradictions, such as the claim the future will not be like the past, well, there doesn't seem to be any logical contradiction there. Then, therefore, according to Hume, that is not necessarily true. At most, that is only contingently true. It happens to be true, but it could be false. So the analytic synthetic distinction and the distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact is also a cleavage between necessarily true claims and contingently true claims, or at least so many empiricists believe. The other dogma that Quine attacks is reductionism, the belief that each meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct built up from terms which refer to immediate experience. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we see this in John Locke, we see this in David Hume, we also see this in the writings of Rudolf Carnap and A.J. Ayer. Quine argues that the effect of abandoning them, so getting rid of these two dogmas, will be a blurring of the supposed boundaries between speculative metaphysics and natural science. We'll see. Keep in mind that the supposed distinction between science deals with experience, whereas supposedly metaphysics does not. Well, if it turns out that all sentences deal with experience to some degree or another, then perhaps there isn't this sharp distinction between science and metaphysics. We'll deal with that in a bit. The second effect would be a shift towards what Quine calls radical pragmatism. We've already been dealing with pragmatism, and this is sort of new wave pragmatism or second generation pragmatism, or I don't know, something like that. There are two halves to Quine's project. The negative is trashing the two dogmas of empiricism, logical positivism, the analytic synthetic distinction, and reductionism. So this is what he does initially in the article, right? He's trashing these two dogmas of the empiricist logical positivists. But then the second half is the positive, where he attempts to naturalize philosophy. Understanding ontology, philosophical ontological commitments, as a matter of pragmatic decision comparable to the natural sciences. So we'll get into this in just a little bit, but to naturalize a philosophical question is to turn that question into something that the natural sciences can address. So if I decide that grace in motion is really a matter of motor efficiency, and science can determine which bodily actions are more motor efficient than others, and physical therapists have formula where they can use this. If you're familiar with ergonomics, this can be studied in a scientific way. Well, then questions of who is more graceful than whom become scientific questions because they can be investigated by the natural sciences. So we would have effectively naturalized grace. Well, anytime we take a previously philosophical question and turn it into a sentence or to a question that the natural sciences can investigate, we are doing what's called naturalizing. Quine thinks that we can sort of naturalize metaphysics so that metaphysical commitments or ontological commitments about what exists and what is real, becomes a question of pragmatic choice from a scientific perspective. In other words, which of the scientific theories available to us is the most useful? And then what are the ontological commitments of that scientific theory? So if we find that atomic theory is the most useful theory for us, in other words, it's the most powerful, it allows us to predict experience, to anticipate experience, to organize their experiences, it solves the various theoretical problems we are trying to solve. So if atomic theory is the most useful theory, then we're committed to whatever the ontological commitments of atomic theory is. So that means we're committed to the existence of things like atoms and you know, you're getting atomic theory from 50 years ago when you're talking to me, but atoms and protons and neutrons and electrons, etc. Right? Are those things real? Well, if those are the ontological commitments of the scientific theory that is most useful to us at the moment, then yes, they are. And that's our ontology, that's our metaphysics. But notice it's not an absolute metaphysics. It's not a metaphysics divorced from experience. It's actually quite wedded to experience. And more specifically, it's quite wedded to pragmatic goals and pragmatic considerations. I don't know why I have a blank. Okay, Quine's big point is he claims that we cannot come up with an adequate non-circular account of analyticity. That no matter how we try to understand analyticity, it ends up being circular. It ends up being viciously circular. And so we can't sort of break out of this analyticity, this loop of meaning. Why isn't this moving? No, really, I'm teasing here. To me, I don't find this a particularly devastating point, to be perfectly honest. Now, I'm sure Quine is wringing his hands, going, "Oh, Kenton doesn't think this is an important point." No, Quine is doing fine. He could care less. But notice, given what analyticity means, it almost sort of shouldn't surprise us that we can't come up with a non-circular concept of what analyticity means. But we'll leave that aside at the moment. Again, this isn't working. Why? Okay. He thinks that it is sufficient, this is sufficient to demonstrate that we should abandon the analytic-synthetic distinction. I must have something going on here. This, in turn, he thinks, is sufficient to discredit reductionism, the belief that each meaningful, factual statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon which the terms refer to immediate experience. So he thinks that if analyticity cannot be understood in a non-circular way, that is sufficient to demonstrate the illegitimacy of the distinction between analytic and synthetic sentences. And that, in turn, is sufficient to discredit reductionism. He will then proceed to naturalize. Oh, that's the negative project. That's the negative project. Now, the positive project. He will then proceed to naturalize philosophy by blurring the supposed boundaries between speculative metaphysics and natural science. The separation of the two require a distinction between analytic and synthetic sentences, relegating the former to philosophy and the latter to natural science. Again, analytic being the logical tautologies and science being the natural sciences, and therefore metaphysics having no ground to stand on. But if that's not a legitimate separation, then perhaps metaphysics has a ground to stand on after all. If successful in discrediting the legitimacy of this distinction, philosophy, and more precisely epistemology, is not importantly distinct from science. So what he's ultimately going to advocate is that we naturalize not only metaphysics, but that we naturalize epistemology. And that questions of epistemology, questions of knowledge, justification, evidence, epistemic warrant, that these ultimately become questions of psychology, empirical psychology. Naturalized epistemology, coined by W.V.O. Quine, Willard Van Orman, is a collection of philosophical views concerned with the theory of knowledge that emphasize the role of natural scientific methods. Like Descartes, Quine takes epistemology to be concerned with the foundations of science, addressing the logical empiricist project of rational reconstruction. He says that, quote, "The Cartesian quest for certainty is the remote motivation of epistemology, both on its conceptual side and its doctrinal side." So he's saying the traditional epistemological questions are worthwhile. And he doesn't fault Descartes for trying to engage in these traditional epistemological questions. He thinks they're mischaracterized when they're seen as being divorced from scientific inquiry and something over and above scientific inquiry. If all we hope for is a reconstruction that links science to experience in explicit ways, short of translation, then it would seem more sensible to settle for psychology. Better to discover how science is in fact developed and learned from that to fabricate a fictitious structure to a similar effect. Epistemology, or something like it, simply falls into place as a chapter of psychology and hence of natural science. It studies the natural phenomenon, physical human subject. So what does he have in mind here? All he's saying is, look, if the question is, how do I come to know? Well, psychology is going to tell me how I come to know. What can I come to know? Well, psychology is going to tell me what I can come to know. What are the best ways of forming reliable beliefs? Well, psychology is going to tell you what the best ways are of forming reliable beliefs. So notice all of the questions that occupy Descartes and the epistemologists to follow him really could be answered and should be answered, according to Quine, by empirical psychology, right? The psychologist, the cognitive scientist, the brain scientist, etc., is in a far better place to answer questions about what we can know, how we can know, of what we can be sure, what we should not, how we cannot know, what is beyond our ability to know, what is an unreliable way of forming beliefs, etc., etc., etc. So these are not questions which are off limits to the empirical sciences. No, they are empirical science questions, or at least they should be, according to Quine. This human subject is accorded a certain experimentally controlled input, certain patterns of irradiation of assorted frequencies, for instance. And in the fullness of time, the subject delivers an output, a description of three-dimensional external world and its history. So we receive all sorts of visual stimulation through our eyes, and we make claims about a three-dimensional description of reality as a result. The relation between the meager input and the torrential output is a relation that we are prompted to study for somewhat the same reasons that always prompted epistemology, namely, in order to see how evidence relates to theory and in what way one's theory of nature transcends any available evidence. So what Quine is pointing out here is that we get meager empirical input and we develop very rich empirical theories about the nature of reality in the world. And it's a good question to ask, how did we go from such meager input to such a rich output? And the part of the answer is going to be the contribution of mind itself, shades of Immanuel Kant here. But who's in a better position to give us that, tell us that story and lay that out for us, other than the empirical psychologists or the neuropsychologists or the cognitive scientists or what? But it's an empirical question through and through, at least from Quine's point of view. But a conspicuous difference between the old epistemology and the epistemological enterprise in the new psychological setting is that we can now make free use of empirical psychology. So again, what Quine is saying is, look, I'm not departing from the old aims of epistemology. I'm not departing from the old questions of epistemology. I embrace them. I'm still interested in the same things that Descartes was interested in. I'm still interested in the same project that they were interested in. But now what I'm saying is, look, let's use empirical psychology to answer these old elemental questions. But note, if evidence, rational, justification, truth, as well as exist, event, cause, time, all derive their meaning within the practice of science, then there is no outside science to go with metaphysical or epistemological concerns. I think it should be to go to with it. So notice what Quine is suggesting is, if words such as evidence, justification, truth, knowledge, belief, if all of those words derive their meaning within the practice of science, then you can't talk about knowledge outside of the scientific project. It has to be done within the scientific project. There is no outside grounds. So if you remember back to my Welcome to the Wonderful World of Philosophy lecture, I had suggested that the question of, does science give us a reliable information about the nature of objective reality, was not a scientific question. That was in my lecture. In fact, that it had to be an epistemological question, a philosophical question. And why was that? According to me, that was because science could not write its own letter of recommendation. So science, you couldn't do science to ratify the reliability of science. And if I am worried about the reliability of science, and you said to me, no, don't worry about the reliability of science, because I did a big bunch of science and it told me that science is reliable. Well, from my perspective, again, that's my lecture, going back to the Welcome to the Wonderful World of Philosophy lecture, that was viciously circular. And I didn't see how that provided any external ratification of science as a guarantor of objective truth. But Quine is making an interesting claim here. He's saying, but look, the words I'm using, rational, justification, whatnot, their meaning arises from the scientific project. And so there is no outside of science. There is no outside authority that is going to be a neutral standing place to say, ah, yes, science is good, or oh, no, science is bad. Because you're already engaged in science when you use these terms. So this was a chart I found online someplace, I forget where, and it's supposed to kind of be mapping out the article that Quine, how he goes, at least where his attack on analyticity. So he starts by looking at analyticity and going to this notion of meaning, and then from the notion of meaning, going to the notion of cognitive synonymy. But then he trots out three different ways of trying to flesh out cognitive synonymy. There's intersubjectivity, where you have substitution, salve veritate. He thinks that's not going to work. Then you might try to trot out or understand synonymy by appeals to definitions, but he points out that there are at least three different concepts of definitions: lexical definitions, explication definitions, and stipulative definitions. The first two will just return you right back to synonymy, so you're back to where you started. Stipulative definitions does not return you to synonymy, but those are when I stipulate, oh, by X, I mean blah, blah, blah. Well, that's an artificial language. And then I'm not really coming up with a notion of synonymy, true enough, but then it's some sort of practical affair where I'm stipulating for some sort of project. Or I could try to understand synonymy in terms of verification, but he thinks that's not going to work either. So no matter what way I try to go from analyticity to meaning to synonymy, I'm going to trip up at synonymy. I'm not going to be able to come up with a satisfying account, and therefore I'm not going to be able to come up with a satisfying account of analyticity. We aren't there yet, but that's essentially the roadmap here. Hang on one moment. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, I'm back. And I'm back to sharing my screen. Quoting from Quine, but I have been urging that this difference is only of degree, and that it turns upon our vaguely pragmatic inclination to adjust one strand of the fabric of science rather than another in accordance in accommodating some particular recalcitrant experience. Conservatism figures in such choices, and so does the quest for simplicity. Each man is given a scientific heritage, plus a continuing barrage of sensory stimulation, and the considerations which guide him in warping his scientific heritage to fit his continuing sensory promptings are, where rational, pragmatic. So what he's saying is look, there are certain forms of our experience that we want to resist giving up. We want to talk about them as if they were necessary. We want to speak about them as if they were sort of a priori necessary truths, when the fact is, it's just we are using language in a particular way we've become quite accustomed to. I'm not being clear at all here. Let's try this again. Is it a necessary truth that gentlemen own land? That anyone who is a gentleman is a landowner? Is that a necessary truth? Well, today, of course, we might say no, right? That's not a necessary truth. But that's because our language has evolved. We don't use the word gentleman in the way that we used to. Once upon a time, yes, that was a necessary truth. The word gentleman meant a male landowner. And no one who failed to own land was a gentleman. But languages evolve, and that's kind of his point here, that what we might today call a necessary analytic truth is more the result of using terms according to a language that we've become quite accustomed to and we don't want to give up. But as languages evolve, as theories evolve, as scientific theories evolve, The meanings of the terms contained within those scientific theories may also evolve, such that what yesterday looked like a necessary claim now today is seen as contingent. This is doing that again. Why is that? What? Oh, I see what happened. I skipped way ahead. All right. Well, then how do I? Oh, no, I don't know what happened. What's going on here? Ah, screen sharing has stopped as the shared window is closed. Oh, okay. All right. Hang on one second. I have to figure out what went on. I think maybe I hit the wrong key and jumped all the way to the end, and my poor PowerPoint doesn't know what to do. Wait, I did this. All right, let's try this again. Share screen. Okay. So I think what happened is I hit end or something like that and it popped to the end. Oh, what I just said though it was more or less accurate, but it was out of sequence with the rest of the lecture. Why is this happening? Well, I did it again. Sorry. There we go. A statement is analytic when it is true. Oh, so here are some popular and historical understandings of what is meant by analyticity. Now, again, Quine doesn't think any of these are going to work, but let's go through them anyway. A statement is analytic when it's true by virtue of the meanings and independent of fact, more or less what Hume had said. Kant had said an analytic statement is one, quote, that attributes to its, that should be predicate, that it attributes to its subject no more than is already conceptually contained in the subject. So for instance, when I say that all bachelors are unmarried, contained within the subject is the concept of unmarried, so the predicate is merely a restatement of something that's already contained in the subject. That's Kant. Necessary propositions and contingent propositions is another way of trying to hold out analytic synthetic distinctions. Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz tries to do this, where he talks about truths of reason versus truths of fact. And for Leibniz, a truth of reason would be a necessary truth that would be true, in his words, in all possible worlds. So a necessary statement is one that's true in all possible worlds. It is not logically possible that it be false, according to Leibniz. In other words, there is no possible world in which it is false. Or you might also say its denial is self-contradictory. Again, that's what Hume has in mind. That's what Leibniz has in mind as well. A statement is contingent if it's not necessary. So what Quine is trotting out here is historical ideas about what constitutes a necessary or analytic statement. True in terms of meaning, conceptually, the predicate is conceptually contained in the subject, true in all possible worlds, the denial of which is self-contradictory, etc. But they all have in mind this common notion of sameness of meaning between the two terms in the sentence. But what is a meaning? What is synonymy? That's what Quine is getting at here. Kant's definition, number one, his definition would restrict us to sentences which are subject-predicate sentences. Okay, fine, but there are certain analytic claims that we might imagine are not subject-predicate. But worse than that, from Quine's perspective, is that it's more metaphorical, because he wants to say that the meaning of one term is contained in the meaning of the other. But what do you mean by contained? Contained is a physical relationship, right? You know, that the milk is contained in the carton, or the marbles are contained in the box, or something like that. That's the literal meaning of contained. What do you mean when you're talking about one meaning being contained in another? And then for Leibniz, this notion of true in all possible worlds, what in the world is a possible world? You'd have to try and make that out. And thereby that is be necessary to come up with a concept of what logical necessity was. You'd have to come up with this notion of logical necessity, and in what sense are denying them self-contradictions. Proposal. A sentence is analytic if and only if true in virtue of the meanings independent of fact. Again, this was Hume and A.J. Ayer as well. But this brings us again back to the question of, well, what is a meaning? Right? The meaning of an expression in the sense that interests us is not its reference or its extension, an object or set of objects to which it refers. So notice Quine is working off of this pragmatist riff, where meanings are going to be tied to practical action, not so much just things that are in your head, but doing things, language and the use of language and the manipulation of language. So he isn't going to want to talk about meanings as an extra linguistic item. He wants to talk about meanings in terms of linguistic behavior. Now, what do you mean by an extension, right? Well, the extension of singular terms would be the objects it names. So for instance, the extension of cat would be all and only objects in the category of cat. The extension of, I could say dog, but you get the idea. Extension refers to the things, the set of objects that are named by that term. The extension of a general term or predicate is the set of objects which that general term is used to reference. So meaning does not equal extension. So what Quine is getting at is that I might know the extension of a term. That doesn't mean I know the meaning of the term. Those seem to be separate concepts, meaning and extension. For instance, this is something you may or may not know. The morning star, the extension of the phrase the morning star, is the planet Venus. And for many years, centuries as far as I know, people talked about the morning star, referred to the morning star, and when they did so, they were referring to the planet Venus, whether they knew it or not. However, sometimes in the very same communities, the term evening star was also used, and it also referred to Venus. So in the case of morning star and evening star, they actually were referring to the same thing. They had the same extension. However, they did not have the same meaning. When people talked about the meaning of morning star, they meant that star which first appears in the morning. When they talked about evening star, they meant that star that first appears in the evening. Now, depending on Venus and its proximity to the Earth and what else is going on in the solar system, sometimes Venus is the first star seen in the morning, sometimes it's the first star seen in the evening, not at the same time of the year, by the way. So for many years, people did not know that the morning star was the evening star. In other words, that the extension of the morning star was the same as the extension of the evening star. And they did not mean by morning star the first star that appears in the evening. nor did they mean by evening star the first star that appears in the morning. So they meant different things by these terms, despite the fact that these terms had the same extension. In a similar way, it turns out that organisms with hearts are organisms with lungs, such that any organism which has a heart is an organism that has lungs, and vice versa. But having a heart doesn't mean having lungs, and having lungs doesn't mean having a heart. While these are coextensional, right, they refer to the same extensions, they're not semantically identical. They don't mean the same thing. Problem then, analyticity has to be understood in terms of meanings, which was somehow intentions, right, rather than extensions of terms. Well, what are these intentions anyway? Properties, individual concepts, or from Frege's notion of senses? Quine claims, once a theory of meaning has sharply been separated from a theory of reference, it is a sure step to recognize that the business of a theory of meaning is simply the synonymy of linguistic forms and the analyticity of statements. Meanings themselves, as an obscure intermediary entity, may well be abandoned. Me again. So what Quine is suggesting is the very notion of meanings or intentions, which are somehow in our head or divorced or separated from linguistic practice or different than linguistic practice. He says, let's do away with that. We don't need to do that. We can talk about a linguistic quality, which is synonymy. And that has to do with terms being synonymous with one another. So don't worry about what you mean or I mean or someone else might mean by words or whatnot. Let's just talk about, in a language, certain terms are referred to as synonymous, and let's try to understand that in terms of a linguistic quality, not a psychological quality, not an internal, in your head quality. But, and again, when he's talking about a linguistic quality, he's talking about the practice of language and how terms are employed in the practice of language. And there are certain rules that govern how you deploy certain terms and you employ certain terms and maneuver and whatnot. So language is a social practice. It doesn't just exist in your head, it doesn't just exist in my head. So whatever meanings are, if there are such things as meanings, let's set that aside as something we needn't concern ourselves with. Let's talk about language, which is a practical affair, and the practice of language and the rules that govern the proper practice of certain languages. And synonymy might be one such rule. Come on now. Meaning themselves as obscure intermediary entities may well be abandoned. So this is what he would like to do. So analyticity has to be understood. Well, no. I think this is here. This is me. Whoa. Oh, now it wants to go. Geez. I think what he's claiming here is that we need not delve into the spooky world of extra linguistic meanings if we can make out the nature of the relationship between sentences in terms of a linguistic quality that we might call synonymy. We don't need intentions, provided that we can give an account of synonymy and thus of analyticity. Bachelor and unmarried male have the same meaning. Now notice that sentence looks like that there are three terms involved here. The term bachelor, the term unmarried male, and this meaning, this thing that they share. So if that were really what's going on here, then we would have to delve into, well, what is the meaning? And let's try to figure out what meanings are. And Again, Quine is thinking that this is going to lead us into a spooky, non-empirical question, right? Can we avoid it? Yes, he does. He thinks we can avoid it. Notice if I said Alice and Betty are the same height, well, this too seems to be suggesting that there are three things involved here: Alice, Betty, and a height. And so Alice has a height and Betty has a height. And so what is this thing that is a height? We have to understand what a height. So it seems like a three-place relationship, just as the previous example seemed to be. But notice if I simply said Alice is exactly as tall as Betty, well, now we only have a two-place relationship. It's just Alice and Betty. Alice is as tall as Betty. Betty is as tall as Alice. And we need not talk about a height at all. Height seems to have been exercised, right? So there doesn't need to be this thing that they both possess. So in a similar way, if we say unmarried male and bachelor, oh, there's this thing that these two phrases possess, which is a meaning. Well, then we have to figure out what is that meaning. But what if we just say, no, bachelor, unmarried male and bachelor are synonymous? We're simply making this claim that there's these two terms and they share synonymy, not a meaning, but a synonymous practice in the language. We can similarly render bachelor and unmarried male have the same meaning more economically by saying that bachelor and unmarried male are synonymous, and we need not posit a third item or third term. What we really have is a two-place linguistic relation between the terms themselves. Meanings and intentions, therefore, have been exercised. So we don't need to talk about the spooky world of meanings and internal intentions and things going on in our head. So he's suggesting we employ the concept synonymy rather than sameness of meaning. That way we don't have to talk about meaning at all. Even if there are no such things as meaning, language independent mysterious items, and we can make do with synonymous, a property of words or sentences. So a point I probably haven't been making as well as I would have liked to, which is if synonymy is a feature of a relationship between two words in a language, such that languages are constructed in such a way that there's a relationship between these words and they are understood to be synonymous, we don't have to talk about sameness of meaning. We can simply talk about how these terms are deployed and what rules govern their usage in the language. Again, such that anytime I use the word bachelor, I could take that out and I could plug in unmarried male and I would be doing okay. Or that's allowed, that's a licensed move. But that has nothing to do with what these words mean. That has to do with what is the licensed move between these two terms. And if they are deemed synonymous, then that's the licensed move. I'm allowed to substitute them. But now we have another problem. What is synonymy? And we need synonymy to understand analyticity. So the problem of analyticity confronts us anew. So we've gone from analyticity to meaning. Oh, that was kind of a red herring. Now we've gone to synonymy. Where do we go after that? Oops. If we suppose if we suppose a prior inventory of logical particles comprising no, un, if, then, and, etc., then in general, a logical truth is a statement which is true and remains true under all reinterpretations of its components other than the logical particles. So no unmarried man is married. And we can reinterpret that as no non-X is X, right? No unmarried male is married, no non-X is X, right? Or we could, if you into quantification logic, for all X, if Fx, then it is not the case that not Fx. Whoops. These are logical truths, and as such are analytic tautologies in the least problematic sense. So Quine is willing to admit that I can develop these sort of logical formulae such that I say every X is an X and no X is a non-X, trivial logical tautologies, and such that under all interpretations, no matter what I plug in for the variables, I'm going to get necessarily true statements. And that is analytic, but those are simple tautologies. The problem is when you start plugging in real values. So it's one thing to say no unmarried male is no unmarried man is married. Even Quine doesn't have a problem with that. But to say no bachelor is married, he's going to have a problem with that. He's going to have a problem with that because it's not logical tautology. It has to do with the use of this word bachelor. And the word bachelor, the use of the word bachelor is defined by the language, and the language is not fixed, right? So just as I might say that no gentleman fails to own land, well, that's simply not true now. Once upon a time, was it true? Yes. Right. But that's because gentleman, I don't want to say means, once upon a time, gentleman and landowner were synonymous. Language defined it thus. They're not synonymous now. The English language no longer defines them thus. And so it ceases to be a necessary analytic truth. But that suggests that it was never just a logical matter. It's always the case that no non-landholder is a landholder. That's always going to be the case. But that's the simple logical tautology, which is unproblematic. What becomes problematic is when we start using other terms that are not simple logical recasting. A, not A, B, not B, etc. But what about the other kind of analyticity? No bachelor is unmarried. So I've kind of gone through this already, but let's back up just a moment. The unproblematic is no X is a non-X. But now when I'm not using exactly the same terms and I'm using different words, then I'm not going to get the kind of logical necessity that you get with the logical tautologies that he finds unproblematic. No bachelor is married, he takes to be more problematic, okay? So perhaps two terms are synonymous if they can be substituted without loss of truth value under all reinterpretations of its components other than the logical particles. My brother is a bachelor would be true if and only if the sentence my brother is an unmarried male is also true. So the idea is, all right, well, look, maybe we want to understand analyticity, the other kind of analyticity, as, all right, but wait a minute. If I can substitute one term for the other, and no matter how or under what circumstances I substitute the one term for the other, I save the truth value such that it's always true. So if it's true my brother is a bachelor, then it's also true that my brother is an unmarried male. And if it's false that my brother is a bachelor, it's also false that my brother is an unmarried male, and vice versa. So we have analyticity when you have substitution preserving the truth value. But the second kind can only be turned into the first kind more than a strict logical tautology and mere or into a mere logical tautology if we recognize bachelor and unmarried are synonymous. So what's his point here? In order for me to realize that the claim no married male is unmarried, let me rephrase that, I did that wrong. For me, in order for me to realize that the statement no unmarried male is married is just as logically necessary as the statement no bachelor is married, if I'm going to realize those are equally necessary, I can only do so if I already realize that unmarried male and bachelor are synonymous. So I have to already know they're synonymous. That means that that formula, that test, oh, well, if I can translate it all the time and it saves the truth value, that test can't be my test of synonymy since I have to know the terms are synonymous in order to realize that it passes the test. But that means that knowing that the first sentence equals the second presumes knowing that they're synonymous. The characteristic of such a statement is that it can be turned into a logical truth by putting synonyms for synonyms. But I have to recognize that they are synonyms. So I only realize that the two sentences are equally logically necessary if I already realize that the terms are synonymous. But that means I can't use that as my test of synonymy, because as I say, I have to know they're synonymous to know that it passes the test. But we still lack a proper characteristic of this second class of analytic statements, inasmuch as we have tried in the above description to lean on the notion of synonymy, which is no less in need of clarification than analyticity itself. Knowing that swapping bachelor for unmarried is a licensed swap requires knowing that the terms are synonymous. Therefore, it can't very well be a test of synonymy. So there I say a little more clearly what I was trying to say in the previous slides. All right, so now we're back to, so this was the intersubstitutivity where I can substitute terms. He doesn't think this is going to work, right? So now we're back to synonymy, and maybe we should go in the route of a definition. There are those, quoting Quine, there are those who find it soothing to say that analytic statements of the second class, reduced to those of the first class, logical truths, by definition. Bachelor, for example, is defined as unmarried male. But what do we mean by definition, Quine asks. There are at least three different kinds of definition, Quine points out: descriptive, explicative, and stipulative. The descriptive definition is simply a generalization of how people actually use the word. So when I'm describing a definition, or when I'm giving like Webster's, right? When Webster's gives the definition of a word, they're not prescribing how we must use the word. They're simply describing how people actually use the word. And as one who is more conservative in his linguistic use laments, language evolves, and people don't continually use the word in the same way. And you know what literal used to mean isn't what literal means today. That drives me nuts. I don't know. Male means today is very different from what it maybe. I'm M-A-I-L, right? So you know, email, is that male? Well, is it literally male? Well, once upon a time, it would probably have been said, no, that's not literally male. But on the other hand, I guess it is male. I don't know, right? So language evolves, language changes, and all the dictionary people are doing, all Webster is doing, is giving you an account of this is how the word is currently used in our language. And of course, dictionaries have to be rewritten all the time because words change their meanings or their usages. I won't go into meanings because Quine doesn't like that. I'll go into the rules which govern their usage in our language shift and change. Explicative definitions are refining meanings where I'm trying to get a little clearer. But again, I'm getting a little clearer, but usually I'm getting clearer about how people use the words, or I'm getting a little clearer how I'm using the word. And then there's stipulative definitions where I say, by this, I mean that, right? So like think of a lawyer's contract where I mean by the party of the first, I'm trying to think of linguistic. What is that? Party of the first. I can't. Oh, and the camera's running, so it always makes it harder for me to think. But you stipulate, right? You stipulate. By this, I mean that, right? By this word, I mean this class of things or this referent things or whatnot. But none of these are going to do the job that the person would hope that they would do in terms of governing synonymy and coming up with a notion of synonymy. Bachelor, the lexical definition of bachelor might say bachelor means unmarried male that has never been married. but we can ask whether the dictionary definition is correct, whether the terms they define really are synonymous. It's simply a claim. This is how people actually use the word. I don't know. That's an empirical claim. It's not a necessarily true claim. And we'd have to go out and look at the world to determine whether people really do use that word that way. Since this is an open question, lexicographical definitions cannot unpack the notion of synonymy. Explication or contextual definition, the purpose is to improve upon the thing being defined by refining and supplementing its meaning. But even explication does rest nevertheless on other pre-existing synonymies. The purpose of explication is to preserve the usage of these favored contexts while sharpening its usage for other contexts. So it appeals to pre-existing synonymies, and we're back to synonymy, and therefore we're no further coming to an understanding of what synonymy means. And then stipulative definitions, right? Example, definition of logical operators in terms of primitives. If P, then Q is defined as not P or Q, right? So we might stipulate that sort of thing. These definitions aren't arbitrary, but depend on purposes in formulating an artificial language. In this case, this would be truth functional logic. But all they deliver is an analyticity in L. So notice if I were to say the phrase if P then Q is synonymous with the phrase not P or Q, right? In other words, the conditional is synonymous with the disjunction. All I'm doing is saying that these are phrases that can be swapped in and out for one another in the language L, language in this case of truth functional logic. So I said, okay, in this artificial language, we can swip these two. And I've stipulated relative to this language, these are move-aroundable. But I'm not grasping at anything which is necessary outside of the particular language I'm speaking at the moment. So all they can deliver is analyticity in L, that particular language. So we can't appeal to truth by definition to understand analyticity. A natural suggestion is that the synonymy of two linguistic forms consists simply in their being interchangeable in all contexts without change of truth value. Interchangeability in Leibniz's phrase salve veritate, right? Saving the truth. Can we understand synonymy as intersubstitutivity, salve veritate, preserving the truth value? So understood as a claim about sentences and not propositions, this means that bachelor and unmarried are synonymous comes to for any sentence where the word bachelor occurs, unmarried male can be substituted and the term and the truth value for the sentence will stay the same. So notice, if we are restricting ourselves to talk about language, in this case, an English sentence, my brother is a bachelor, my brother is an unmarried male, two English sentences. But if we're really talking about language and not something like propositions, propositions are presumably the meaning of the sentence, but remember, Quine doesn't want to deal with meanings. He wants to deal with language, what is actually said, the linguistic and social practices, right? But it's clear that bachelor and unmarried male can't be substituted in every English sentence and save the meaning. The question remains whether interchangeability salve veritate is a strong enough condition for synonymy or whether some non-synonymous expressions might thus be interchangeable. It might be sufficient even if, it might not be sufficient even if necessary. We are not concerned here with synonymy in the sense of a complete identity of psychological associations or poetic quality. We are concerned only with what may be called cognitive synonymy. But what we need is an account of cognitive synonymy, which does not presuppose analyticity. Perhaps we can make our synonymy as intersubstitutability salve veritate. Two terms are synonymous if in any sentence if one, let's try that. In any sentence is which one is used. I think in which one is used. Yeah, that should be in. The other can be substituted without changing the truth value. So that's what we mean by salve veritate, right? But Quine presents a dilemma for this approach. Either the languages are extensional or they're rich and then non-extensional. In a purely extensional language, non-synonymous terms are substitutable salve veritate, right? So remember we talked about the fact that if all we're talking about is the reference class of the thing, and we say, okay, that's what I mean. If I have two terms and they have exactly the same reference class, then they are synonymous. Well, but that's not the case, right? We saw that with the morning star, evening star example. They have the same reference class, they're not synonymous. Or we saw that with the organisms with kidneys versus organisms with hearts. I think the previous example I used was organisms with lungs and organisms with hearts, but you get the idea. So yeah, those are coextensional, but that isn't what we mean by synonymous. Right? The language rich enough to block the intersubstitutability of non-synonymous terms presupposes an understanding of analyticity. You have to know that they're not synonymous in order to block the right ones. So I have to know that things with hearts is not synonymous with things with kidneys to recognize the fact that despite being coextensional, they aren't analytic. I said that already. I think I said that already. Yes. Okay. In a purely extensional language, non-synonymous terms are, all right, but I did that already. Okay, fine. Oh, yeah, so morning star rises in the morning. The evening star rises in the morning. Well, we know that those two sentences are not both true. Because we know that morning star and evening star are not synonymous. Where intersubstitutability salve veritate with respect to extensions only, the criterion determining synonymy, the morning star and the evening star would be synonymous, but they're not. Likewise, Lois Lane believes she is having lunch with Clark Kent this afternoon. Lois Lane believes she's having lunch with Superman this afternoon. The first sentence might be true and the second sentence might be false, despite the fact that Clark Kent and Superman are coextensive terms. Spoiler alert, hope that didn't surprise anyone. A language, I said already. So to say that they don't mean the same thing requires already knowing that they're not synonymous. We said all that already. What am I going back on? So can extensional equivalency, a linguistic property, be synonymy? No, apparently it cannot.